Is it? Hello, hello?
Yeah.
Oh, it is. It's on.
Yours is on. It's recording.
Hello, hello. Okay, great. That sounds good. Okay.
Hello, everybody. We're starting an artist talk right now, so everybody's welcome to join, but we are recording, so just letting you know. All right. Okay. Welcome. My name is Brian Holcomb. I'm the curator at the Moss Arts Center, and I'm happy to present our first artist talk over here at the CID, Getting Beyond the Moss. So if you guys have been to the Moss Arts Center and you've seen the big murals in the corridor and on the exterior of the building, that's who we are here to share with you tonight, Conor McGrady, who's come here all the way from Ireland. So, yeah. So I'm going to say a couple of words, but for y'all to know, we have two current exhibitions up now until April 22nd, Anne Samat and Yanira Collado. Both of them were here in residence. Yanira was actually here for 2 weeks to create the pieces that she has in the show, and she worked with over 200 architecture students during the 2 weeks. So, and then one of the pieces she created from the show will actually become part of our Virginia Tech art collection in a couple of years. All right, so tonight I wanted to introduce Conor McGrady. He was born in Downpatrick, Northern Ireland in 1970. He primarily works in painting and drawing. McGrady's work examines the role of authority in contemporary society, mainly in how power is manifested and represented in architecture, urban space, and individual and collective actions. The work arises from situations of civil unrest and social instability, often drawing upon the artist's experience growing up in Northern Ireland. McGrady has exhibited internationally with one-person exhibitions in New York, Miami, Atlanta, and Split, Croatia. Group exhibitions include the 2002 Whitney Biennial in New York, the Qalandiya International Biennial in Jerusalem, the D0 Arc Underground Biennial of Contemporary Art in Sarajevo, the IK-00 Spaces of Confinement in Venice, Italy. Conor is also the editor of the Radical History Review, Curated Spaces, published by Duke University Press. And Conor lives and works in Burren, Ireland, where he's the Dean of Academic Affairs at the Burren College of Art. So please join me in welcoming Conor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you all for coming. Special thanks to the Moss Arts Center for hosting the project with the murals. It's really amazing to be able to see them in person. And thanks, Hudson, for the tech and the setup as well, so thank you. I'm going to rattle through some slides, and hopefully I'll try my best to not put you all to sleep. And I'm just giving this a sort of provisional title of entering the control zone, because this idea of zones and control and territory is quite a dominant theme in the work. And the term control zone comes from the conflict in the north of Ireland, where I'm from originally. Control zones are areas that are under very, very strict military surveillance during the conflict in the north. So I'll talk. So anyway, just to get going, I'm going to start with this image. This is the Mourne Mountains south of Belfast, not that far from where I grew up. So it's very bucolic landscape. Right these days, it's very popular with hikers, and the tourism's picking up. Game of Thrones is filmed. Some of it was filmed around here, so it's become. Game of Thrones has done more for tourism in the north of Ireland than any government initiative could ever have done. So it's become very popular as a destination. But during the conflict, this area was essentially the site of an insurgency and counterinsurgency. You had, since the Northern Irish state was created 100 years ago, it remained, Ireland was Britain's first colony. So everything that the British then took to Africa and Asia and other parts of the world as a colonial power. They tried and tested first in Ireland, you know, abolishment of the language, abolishment of education, playing different people, different groupings against each other. So 100 years ago, there was a revolutionary movement to end this colonial relationship. But what happened was it resulted in the division of the country, the partition of the country. In the 1960s, the northern state that remained part of Britain, there was another uprising to try to remove the British presence as a sort of a colonial power, as it were. And this led to 30 years of what's often referred to as low-intensity warfare. So a war, not a hot war like you have in Ukraine at the moment, but maybe something more akin to the Israeli-Palestinian situation during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So during this period, this area, from a military standpoint, everything that you see as forest was a threat because it couldn't be controlled by traditional surveillance. And everything that was open was under very heavy policing and surveillance. So the reason I'm showing you this slide is that this is a bucolic, even romantic landscape. But in a conflict situation, it becomes contested, dangerous terrain to be fought over, terrain to be policed, terrain to be controlled, in a sense. And I'm going to come back to that a bit later. So just to give you, I'm not going to bore you with a whole history lesson, but this is the area I grew up in the 1980s. There were constant, very heavy military presence. There were constant attacks on the British. This is British Army. There were constant attacks on the British Army by Irish Republicans, sort of guerrilla forces, if you like. Bombings, you know, so it was a sort of a shooting, sniping, bombing war, in a sense. But I grew up during this, so it was normal in a sense. It was normal to be stopped and searched, have guns pointed at you, and to be off school because of a bombing, or, you know, or to have the windows be blown in because of a bombing at times as well. And you can barely see, but the soldiers crouching here, pointing at these young men. That was our local chip shop. The police station, and this was my run to school pretty much on not a daily basis, but a fairly regular basis. So it was a very heavily policed, it was a police state, essentially. You know, I think it's fair to call it a police state. So a place of tension, a place of control, a contested space. But growing up and living in it, normalized. It's normal, you have nothing to compare it to. So as a young person, this is normality in a way. So it was like, you know, so basically again, and there were constant eruptions, and these eruptions still happen. So we're 20 years into a peace process, but you still have flare-ups. Northern Ireland's still part of Britain. Around half the population want Irish unification. The other half want to remain British. So you still have, even though you don't have the hot war at the minute, you still have tensions, flare-ups. The situation around Brexit, Britain leaving the EU, has caused more flare-ups recently as well. You've got competing identities in the north as well. You've got those who see themselves as Irish and who historically would have been discriminated against, treated as second-class citizens because of that. And you've got those who see themselves as British, who historically have had more status and control in the north, but now see that they, with more equality, that they feel they're losing that control, or losing that status to in a certain sense. So this is I know this is very general and very simplistic, but I'm hoping it just gives you a context of where the work emerges from. This very fractured, sort of very traumatic landscape in a way, looking back at it. And I should say the photos are by a photographer from the area, from Downpatrick, where I was born, called Bobby Hanvey. So I make large-scale works, often very figurative, often figurative works. So I'm just going to show you 3 of these before getting into the recent work. And they're large-scale paintings, 60 by 72 inches. I've always made large-scale work, and they address this idea of control, of policing, of militarization, and control of not just of urban spaces and the body in the urban space, but also of rural terrain as well. So, and again, I'm using black and white. I used to make full color images, full color works, very much inspired by the history of painting. But I started stripping out the color, and I was referencing, well, also the history of graphic work. Artists like Goya, of course, historically, disasters of war, but also comics that were an influence on me growing up, graphic novels more recently. And, but also the use of white became symbolic, and it's taken from a writer called Alan Feldman who talked about the North, that under surveillance and interrogation in police cells, white becomes the color of complete exposure. There's nowhere to hide. And so it becomes about the removal of self, this idea, there's nowhere, of complete sort of visual control, complete visual dominance. But it's also about sanitization and removal and absence. This idea of removing unwanted people, you know, in a way. And this is what most of, you can say war is more often or not than not about this. Who gets to have a voice and who's removed, physically or otherwise. And there's also, yeah.
Am I the question?
Yeah, please.
So
yeah.
The medium you're using,
yeah.
the white, painting the white on,
yeah.
and then are you painting the figures on the white?
Both simultaneously. So I'm using quite thick. It's hard to see because of the, even, you know, how great digital is. You don't really get that sense of the thickness of paint. So the white paint's quite thick, but I leave space for the darker images, and I just sort of work them up simultaneously.
And what's the
medium?
It's
oil. These are oil on canvas. Yeah, so yeah, straightforward oil on canvas. So again, sort of always been interested in power and how power is represented symbolically. So this is not an image you would see, you know, in real life, but so I'm playing with this idea of authoritarianism and how power likes to see or likes to represent itself or view itself in a sense. There's certain individuals might be very happy to see themselves depicted like this, but so it's again, I'm looking at sort of the symbolic representation of power or authority. And again, another one back to the landscape and about control. So this looks like a picnic, but there's an element of disquiet and threat, because the male figure is wearing combat boots, is dressed in black. There's an authoritarian, almost quasi-fascist element. So it's about this idea of the landscape as a site of control. And again, everything is empty and removed from behind it in a way. So I'm also very interested in how you don't have to physically depict acts of violence, but you can just, through that sense of tension or disquiet, conjure up that idea of threat in a way. So I'm going to talk about, Brian mentioned Split in Croatia.
I've got another question.
Yeah.
Going back to the, I don't need it. Are those haystacks in the back?
They are, yeah.
And is that significant for Ireland at all?
This northern region, this is the Mourne Mountains that I opened with. This is the same mountain range that was in the photograph. And that's very common way of stacking hay. Yeah.
I've seen that.
In that region, yeah. You go to different parts of the country, they do it differently. Now they roll things up in big bales and cover them in plastic. But that's a very old traditional way of stacking hay. So it's a very damp climate. So it's to try to let it dry before gathering it. So you would see that in the north, yeah. But yeah, thanks. So in 2021, I had an exhibition in the Museum of Fine Art in Split, and it's really my first one-person exhibition, museum exhibition. And I did a research trip. They brought me over to do a research trip before the exhibition, and there's two elements that came into the work that sort of feed their way into what the murals in a strange way. And one is this idea of modernist architecture in Croatia. Now, Croatia was part of Yugoslavia. After the Second World War, it was a communist state, and they embraced this radical approach to modernist architecture. And in post-war Yugoslavia, modernism was this language of social progress, a new society, post-war, an end to all the chaos and destruction of the Second World War. So you've got these incredibly futuristic building projects that took place mostly in the 1960s and 70s. So you've got this legacy of modernism as this driving force for progress. But at the same time, you also had the Cold War. So alongside this visionary approach to building and creating housing for people, you also had the building of bunkers, military fortifications, underground, defensive capability because of the fear of nuclear war during the Cold War period. So I'm really interested in this idea of architecture as progress, or ideas of progress on the one hand, and ideas of restriction and control on the other hand. So this is Split 3, this incredible, almost like sci-fi housing complex in the city of Split on the Dalmatian coast. They're quite run down now, but they haven't been maintained since Croatia had a civil war in the 1990s when Yugoslavia fell apart. So the buildings are quite run down, but they're still used, they're functioning, they're public housing. But that modernist project ended with the collapse of Yugoslavia and again in civil war in the 1990s. And of course, you've got these network of islands around the area, and they became this site of bunkers and military fortifications. So this island of Vis, during World War II, it was an anti-fascist forces were stationed there. The Allies were working with partisans to defeat the Nazis. After the end of World War II, they established military bases and a nuclear capacity. So they had missiles and missile silos on these bases. So as an artist, I was invited to go nosing around all of these legacies, these remnants. So some of the fortifications from World War II, and all of these bunkers that still exist from the Cold War period. And you can go into them and work your way around them. So again, I'm just really interested in this idea of progress and control, something that sets that back or impedes that at the same time. And it reminds me very much of my own upbringing in the North, where it was basically a war, so there wasn't this utopian modernist vision for social change or social progress. But it's very interesting when you compare the situation in Cold War politics, where you've this desire to sort of provide better living conditions for people, but this constant tension at the same time. So I started working on a series of large drawings. I just put that one in for scale, and these drawings were brought over and exhibited at the Museum of Fine Art in Split. So the large drawings are all works on paper. They're gouache. They're gouache from Fabriano. And they hang them in panels, almost like you're working like on Japanese screens in a way. So they're easy to store, they're easy to transport. What I was interested in for these was this idea of the performance of public rituals associated with ideas of nationalism and the nation state. So it's like the performance of power, the symbolic performance of power. It doesn't have to be sort of military parades or anything like that. Government officials signing documents. That's, it's a performative act. The signing of a treaty, the signing of a covenant. But always in these large-scale works is a sense of repressed control, body language, tension. I use myself as a model because I'm available. So they're not supposed to. It's not supposed to be me necessarily. It's just you just point a camera and you've got source material. So they're really about these sort of ritual performances in a way. Again, it's the exchange of a flag in a sense. So public rituals, private rituals, this idea of authority and compliance, but also a sense of dignity, because it's things that power is complex. It's not. I don't want to narrow it down to just abuse and resistance. There are elements of ambiguities and subtleties. So I suppose I'm inherent in how power is performed socially, and I'm interested in that complicated relationship we have to power and how that plays out through images, large-scale images.
Connor, on that one, what's the significance of the trees?
Again, this becomes more apparent as I get into the landscape, because again, it's this ties into that modernist ideal, which is again about building conditions better living conditions. So the idea of the garden, the idea of bringing nature into the urban space, there's subtle hints, subtle references to that. So again, like urban planning, so the same idea, you know, this idea of the performance of building for the future. So this is not necessary as public building projects. They used to get these large-scale civic. These days, I think in the West, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in the US, it's largely private development dominates. But there was a period when this idea of civic building projects that were benefiting communities and people, there was a fanfare around that at one point. Yeah.
So I'm really struck by these gray outlines around
Yeah.
the figures. I don't know if it feels to you like it creates them into emblems or
Yeah.
it's like a force field, or can you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. I always forget to mention that. Originally, when I started working on this scale, I didn't have those. And I didn't like the images. They were too hard. It just looked like graphic novel style. And it was too hard edge for me. So because it's gouache on paper, I wanted to try and bleed the medium and try to get the work to become, the water-based medium to be more fluid. And through that process of just trying something out, they ended up becoming these auras in a way. And it started making me think, retrospectively, there was no think first, then make it, sort of more through reflection, that they feel like it makes the figures more iconic in a way. So they've got this sort of iconic element to them. So they function as almost as ciphers, if you like, icons rather than real people. And that, in a way, I like that because it ties back into the performance of ritual. You know, so it's the individual self is absent, and it's the self that's performing for, as almost as a cipher or an icon of something, if that makes sense. So again, elements of respect for the flag. Flags in the Irish context are still being fought over. It's very, a lot of tension over flags in the north still. If there is ever Irish unification, there's discussions about will there be a new flag. I look at South Africa after the end of apartheid. They created a new flag for the new South African state when the ANC came to power in the 90s. The Irish flag is tied up in this sort of anti-colonial struggle, and people feel that they won't want to give it up. And the British flag's important to the loyalist community in the north, so flags remain important. So again, so it's also what I'm saying. This is elements of compliance and dignity, but also contradiction in a lot of these sort of rituals in a way. The recognition, the award ceremonies. So there's a whole series of these. And public execution as well, because this is, when you're looking at the state and state power, very few, it'd be hard pushed to find a single nation state that's not founded on violence and retains violence at its core in reserves. There's a violent reserve in every state, and so of course, in the US you still have capital punishment. I mean, it's not beheadings, but it was removed in Ireland in the 1950s, but you still have parts of the world where the public performance of execution as a form of symbolically displaying state power is real, is still very real. So these are theatrical images in a way, but they're still tapping into those notions of public performance. So these are the large-scale figurative works, and then I produce these smaller architectural works that are a little bit more subtle in a way. Looking again at the bunker and defensive architecture or architecture as an intrusion in the landscape, as a barrier in a way. So I produced loads of these, and these are much smaller, and these are in Yupo. That's a typo. It should be Yupo, not Yup. But and I like the quality of Yupo because it feels like a print, and I've done quite a bit of printmaking in the past as well. So again, this idea of the fortress, the walled enclosure, the border, boundaries, terrain, territory in a sense, but also maybe a little bit quite cold, quite stark, yeah, quite stark images in a way as well. And then to get into the landscapes, some of which are over in the moss at the moment. So I started with this series where the bunker is still real. You know, of course, it's more abstract or more symbolically represented here, these watchtowers, but it starts to intrude into the landscape. So I started becoming really interested in the rendering of landscape through these almost this romantic language in a way, but this still has this sort of concrete fortification. And I just decided to take them out all together. So when I say romantic, I'm looking at how landscape is romanticized, this idea of national terrain, tourist imagery, you know, again, the bucolic, this idea of the sublime, that the landscape is a place to lose oneself, and how landscape is marketed, presented, embodied in contemporary culture right across the board. But going back to my first slide, that, you know, my experience of landscape growing up was always this darker side to it. It was this sense of disquiet. So this is one of the reasons they're rendered in such a stark way. I'm playing with this idea of something that's sumptuous and romantic, but also quite harsh and maybe alienating and unforgiving in a way. So I'm really interested in that relationship between landscape and ideology. And in the context of Europe, the landscape, these mountain ranges in Europe often form natural borders or boundaries between nation states. And when you look at the context of Europe in the past decade with migration and more recently, you know, you've got economic migration and migration from refugees. There's a tightening of borders, a tightening of fortifications, a tightening of defenses. It starts to play back into this sort of ideology of nationalism. You know, who is in, who is out? If the state is a walled garden, it's a place for us. Right, well, if this is for us, they must be kept out. But who are them? Who is the they? So it raises up all of these questions. I live in the EU, you know, and it's supposed to be open borders, open migration. But you're seeing this rising nationalism all across Europe because of fear of. It's the same old scapegoating, you know. The immigrants will steal the jobs, you know. So this is what Brexit has come out of in a way. So Brexit is a sort of nationalist project that isn't putting up hard physical borders, but it's about that ring fencing of the nation state as this idea of who gets to stay in and who gets. It's an othering. It's yet another form of othering. Who's on the other side of the wall, in a sense. So this is all in the mix when I'm thinking about landscape. Right? So it's, but I don't deny that I like the power of landscape as images. You know, that sort of that romantic language. So I'm playing with that in a way as well. So maybe trying to subvert it in a sense. And I should say as well, these are panoramic. So the murals you're seeing the sort of just the panoramic bit. But on the actual drawings, I leave these white bits on the other side. Because I'm also very interested in film and in cinema and the relation and how cinema shapes popular consciousness. So they read in a way like film stills or a narrative. And I might get to that at the end if everyone's still awake. So just stop me if I'm going, you know, I hope I'm not boring anyone just yet. So again, I did dozens of these, a couple of dozen, like there's about 20-something of them. But I'm only going to show you a few. And the mountain ranges are taken from Ireland, but they're also taken from some of them, these research trips to Croatia and then other areas. So they're not meant to be a particular place. It's really about the idea of place, the idea of terrain, the idea of boundaries, borders. So just to give you a sense of these. And they're all 22 by 32 inches. So they're scaled up for the installation over in Moss. And yesterday I saw them for the first time, and I like how the medium of gouache still reads as sort of water-based. They almost take on a more of a Zen quality at that scale. And I look at the whole history of art. I mean, this is what I say to my students. The whole history of painting is your teacher. And not just Western European tropes. You have to look at everything that's been produced. And so again, looking at, I referenced Japanese screens earlier, but I quite like this empty space that you get in a lot of Zen painting as well. So, but these are anti-Zen in a way. They're ideologically loaded. So smaller works. I'll just rattle through some of the ones in the series. And then I was making these during COVID, and I think that sense of anxiety and threat and the dystopian element of COVID really started coming into play. So some of the work started getting figurative again and quite going back to Goya that I mentioned. So playing with these. So I was using these as a way just to play with this space taken from these research trips. These Second World War fortifications. And again, the architecture, the modernist architecture, started to sort of become almost like a fortress or a wall in its own way as well. So, and again, I'm also, there's a filmmaker I'm really interested in, Adam Curtis, and he talks about that politics used to be about big ideas. It used to be about capitalism versus communism, but they're ideological. People sort of stake their claim on a particular visions for how society should be organized. But with the collapse of the Cold War, he argues that politics has become about management and about the management of dysfunctional systems. So that politics is, at the minute, has the absence of vision. Or, as we're seeing in parts, especially in Europe, or it's that absence of vision coupled with fear of immigration is driving a rightward shift. So the ideology that's coming to the fore is an ideology of xenophobia, racism, fascism, in a lot of European countries at the moment. We don't have it strongly in Ireland, and which I'm thankful for that I live in the south of Ireland. It's a republic, and there's problems. There's problems everywhere, but we don't have that hard sort of rightward shift that you're getting in other areas. So it's this idea of this absence of vision, which is in stark contrast to the modernist ideal of progress and trying to build a better society for people in a way. So these buildings start to become bunkers or fortifications. So again, there's bringing in these sort of narrative elements of almost like again, like I mentioned, Goya, so the figures start to sort of, there's, removal within the landscape, extracting people from the landscape, the policing, the control of the landscape again. So for some reason, Goya and the work of Goya started having a particular resonance during COVID. So some of these there's a bit of that comes into the work. And again, the executions. I've always done executions. They're not new to that, the work I'm just showing you. They've popped up quite a lot. And again, this extraction of bodies from the landscape, in a sense. So, just to give you, and just to show you, that you've got the murals over in Moss, and when I was in Split for this museum show, they asked me to do something on the wall. I didn't have a lot of time, but I thought, okay, I'll just go for it. So I started producing this large-scale mural in the gallery, and this is just to give you an idea of scale. And while I was doing that, the annual Pride Parade was going past the museum. But this is really contentious because every year, Pride in Croatia, until very recently, has been deeply politicized and very, very contentious. You got neo-Nazi groups, fascist groups attack the Pride demonstration, or the Pride March, if you like. So the museum openly came out in support of Pride and had a rainbow flag. I'll show you that in a second. But it was the whole parade was saturated with police. It was like being back in Belfast again. And it went off completely peacefully, which is great. I mean, nothing happened. But there's been a lot of the ex-Yugoslav republics, there's been fierce battles fought over Pride in recent over the past decade, really. But so I broke working on the mural just to go out and watch the parade go past, and it was just real ironic, I suppose, that I'm installing this work in the gallery, and it's about control, policing, authority to a certain extent, and here it's just on the street at the same time. So, I mean, this is, this image here. So you've got the museum, you've got the rainbow flag, and you've got the police. And they were using the museum as base of operations as well. Everything went off peacefully, but the museum were really worried that, neo-Nazis were going to break the windows, or, so it was quite tense until it was over, And then just to give you an idea of the install for the exhibition, so large-scale works in the space. I'm not going to talk too much about, it's a museum space, and it was great to be able to work in a museum context and to present the sort of work as part of a holistic framework in a way. Yeah, so you can see here these ones, and those are the images that have ended up in the mosque across the way as well. So they're deliberately installed like a film strip, in a sense. And this was during COVID, so we had limited bodies in the gallery at limited times, but it was still important that it was able to take place. And then these smaller drawings that I showed you clips of. And I'm continuing to work on these. So again, there's always been that idea of architecture, a natural landscape, and figurative work, either performed or a little bit more dramatic, I suppose. And just to give you an idea. And then we had a few people for the opening. There were like 15 people in the museum at a time for the opening. I don't know how it was here, but it was, those were the restrictions. And I showed a film that I worked on, and if you want, I'll show you a quick clip of it. And these are some stills from the film. I'd worked with an artist who's a friend of mine based in Ireland. He's from London originally, Stephen Stapleton. And he goes under this sort of avant-garde project called Nurse with Wound. That's sort of almost data music in a way. He's been producing music since 1980. And he basically suggested making an experimental film that he would produce the music to. And that at some point it could be shown in a public context, maybe as part of a performance. In a sense, but COVID put all that, so we weren't able to actually screen it as part of a performance. But I was able to run it do a screening of it in Croatia. So it recycles a lot of the images from the drawings and just expands them through the language of actually existing architectural formations or actual footage of landscapes as well. So it's a complete experiment, but I've been so obsessed with film for so many years. It was really enjoyable to work on it. So these are just a few stills, and I'll show you a clip in a second. It gets quite intense in the middle. I'll just show you the bit that relates to the murals. Okay, and then the last couple of slides. Well, you know this. So, yeah, and like I said, it was really amazing to be able to see these yesterday. And thanks for all the support, for Brian for proposing this and having them installed. And and it's inspired me to maybe start working on paper on this scale for landscapes as well, so we'll see. And I don't need to show you these, you've seen them. So what I do want to do was just bring up the film, if you want to just watch a... Yeah, and whenever they're photographed or, I leave those in, because I like the deckled edge and the bricks, and they're not, they read as 15 feet panels, but they're really, the bricks are important as well. They're just, I think it's just to believe that paper is paper and it behaves like paper. It buckles, it curves, It has those decal edges, and I'm not really interested in trying to hide that in a sense. Yeah. But I like how they read like screens in a way. Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure if, do I have to cancel out of the PowerPoint? Oh, yeah. Mightn't be able to show you this. No, okay. It might be a mirroring screen issue. Let me just see. Okay, here we go. The film was during, okay, here we go. The film was during, it was last year. So how do I get full screen on this? There we go. The film was last year. So, what is that? So, yeah, I had a version of it in 2021, but it was officially sort of finished in 2022. So I'll just show you a couple of minutes of it. It starts quite meditative, it gets more intense, but I'll just show you the first bit of it. Just while it's running, so when you have a large-scale image that's immersive, but you're relating to it, just through physical proximity to it. So what I suppose I wanted to do with this was to create a sense of, to expand that sense of immersion in a way, through sound, through movement, through creating more of a sensorial engagement rather than just the visual, just the ocular. Yeah, just a little run for another second. So at some point, I'm hoping I can still screen it as part of a live performance for this Stephen. We'll see, hopefully, that's possible. Well, that gives you an idea. So I can leave it at that if you want. The soundtrack was Stephen Stapleton. It goes by Nurse with Wound. So he has a band, but it's been his project for 40 plus years at this point. Yeah, he's quite well known. He's from London. He's quite well known, sort of an underground avant-garde scene, and he's played here in the US over the years as well. But it's sort of he's part of that sort of underground wave that came out in post-punk, the post-punk generation, sort of in the 1980s. Yeah. Okay.
If anybody has any questions for Conor, it would be now a great time to thank you, Conor.
Oh, great. So I hope I didn't bore everyone into submission.
You said you were going to, you're going to turn this into some kind of a performance. Did I hear that right? What do you mean by that?
Well, just it would be a live performance with a screening, essentially. So whether that's on a single screen or multiple screens, or creating more of an environment for. No, not actors, not props. More of a sort of an audiovisual installation for an audience. So rather than an audience sitting watching it on the screen, it would be maybe something that's more of an immersive environment in a way. So that would be the idea, but it hasn't. COVID sort of put paid to that. Well, now things are open again, so hopefully there's a possibility of still doing that.
Yeah, he was just saying, show it in the cube or something. It could be like a 4-channel thing in there.
That'd be amazing.
Have you been in the cube?
I haven't, but I've seen it on the video monitors, and yeah.
That's the perfect venue.
Excellent. Yeah. No, yeah. It's sort of been on hold a little bit, but now now putting together this presentation, it's just made me think, I should reactivate that again, so it doesn't just sit as a little film experiment and gathering dust. That it can give it some life in a way.
Can we see some of it like there somewhere, like 30 minutes in?
Well, there's a little. It gets quite intense.
I can handle it.
I can show you. I'll show you the end scenes. Actually, because I used the landscape again about. Let me just see if I can. Yeah.
I was wondering that you only work with monochromatic, achromatic, I thought. But then in the end of the video,
Yeah.
the colors are showing up.
Yeah.
Is there any signification? Do you incorporate the colors?
Well, I mentioned it at the beginning that all of the early work, I didn't show any of it here because it just the whole other talk is full color. So I've always worked with color, and it was a strategy just to gradually remove it. But it was also symbolic because it was about the work's about sort of removal and control of people and populations. So the lack of color started symbolically having that role. But for this, because I didn't want it just to sort of be animating the drawings, I wanted it to start to refer to real footage, actually existing footage. So it's come back in for the film. But I quite like that play between these sort of graphic, monochromatic language of drawing and film footage, which is full color. Yeah.
And the music for the film, was that collaborative between you and the musician, or
Yeah.
what kind of conversations were you having?
Basically, it wasn't, it's very informal. It was basically, he had music he was working on. I was working on this, and it was just discussions like, well, speed, what sort of tempo are we looking at? Maybe quite slow, ethereal? Are we talking about hard? Because he's done quite abrasive work as well. So I think it was very informal and very loose, and we sort of just settled on the idea that, yeah, it would be quite slow but intense in spots, but that the music would have, would have that sort of matching tempo. So when we put the music and the images together, it just seemed to align, but it was all just through verbal conversation in a way. We didn't, right, try this bit with this music, and this, there was none of that. It was purely verbal, and then it just completely aligned in terms of, so yeah, it was a really interesting way of working in a way, maybe almost subconscious in a sense. Yeah. I'll say, if you want, I'll just say if there's anything sort of more intense bits from the middle. Yeah, there's images here from, the footage is from Belfast, from riots actually. There's actually a little bit of recycling of some early work in this as well. Leave it there with the void. Anyway, it's long. The whole thing's an hour rather. Watch my accent. But this is why it lends itself to the sort of more like this immersive, maybe a live performance for the audio. And I mean, the software you can get to the music will respond to the images, or the images will respond to the music. But I'm quite analog, and I don't see myself as a filmmaker. This was all just done very, very low tech, and I think Stephen is also likes the analog way of working, and so anyway, so hopefully there's an opportunity to do that. Yeah. Yeah, thank you all. Thanks. Thanks for coming. I hope I haven't depressed anyone. So, great. Thanks very much.
I hadn't thought about Swiss Weird in a long time.
Oh, yeah, great.
Yeah, wonderful music, and I loved the collaboration there.
Yeah.
It was really lovely.
Excellent.
I had a question for you. I didn't want to.
Yeah.